Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for a Wrestling Mind podcast. Enjoy the show.
Well, I was a fanatic. There's no doubt a fanatic. My goal was to get carried out of the wrestling room because of exhaustion, and it never happened. The thing it did for me every day about 6 o'clock is that when I got out, I looked back in and there was nobody else there. Bottom line was I didn't reach my goal. So guess what happened? I went back in the room again. But I got some quality time because of just some kind of a fanatic goal.
Oh, Season 1, Episode 3. How we doing? This is Wrestling Mind Podcast with your host, Ryan Warner. It's good to talk to you folks again. Now, of course, I can't hear you, but I know you're out there. Thank you for listening. Now, today we have Nancy Schultz on the podcast. Nancy is the former wife of Dave Schultz, who was tragically killed by John DuPont on Foxcatcher Farms back in the 90s. Now, for those of you who don't know Dave, he was one of the greatest ambassadors the sport of wrestling's ever known. Right? Athletically, he was an Olympic champ, a world champ, an NCAA champ. But off the mat, he was loved around the world. He spoke Russian. He traveled over there many times. And again, this is just a really fascinating interview where Nancy introduces you to Dave through stories you've never heard before, right? There's a lot of new content on here. So before we get into it, it's Fan of the Week time. And this one goes to my good friend Chris DeVito the fourth, as he'd have you say it. Huge wrestling fan, great wrestler in his own right. Chris, thanks for your support, man. Really appreciate it. Now, let's get into the interview with Nancy Schultz on the legend of Dave Schultz. All right, Nancy, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Ryan. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Hey, it's really my pleasure. I'm super excited for this. And as we've talked about, I really want to introduce Dave to the listeners and hopefully uncover some cool stories that maybe aren't out there. I think just to start, one area that I haven't found a lot about is Dave's childhood. So just talk us, what was Dave's childhood like?
Sure. Well, Dave had struggled when he was early. He had dyslexia. So his early school days were a little rough. He wasn't very successful at school, and there wasn't the kind of knowledge about dyslexia and learning disabilities back then. So he was ridiculed by his, fellow peers in school, also by some of the teachers, who'd accuse him of not trying and stuff. And it turns out Dave was brilliant. His IQ was ridiculous, and he was a very intelligent young man, but the dyslexia and the reading part, showed itself. And he was a little heavy. In fact, his first nickname, I think, when he was in grade school was Tubby Tuba, which I'm sure. So he was having this trouble. He was getting pushed around in school. He was not doing that well. And a PE teacher saw him, had been researching how different types of physical environment can help kids with dyslexia. There's some motor skills that help produce some left-right, patterns in the brain by certain skills. And so I think Dave was in 6th grade going into 7th, and this teacher suggested, he said, I think you'd be good at wrestling. And I think it would be good for you, not only physically, but for your brain. And Dave said he walked into a wrestling room and he said as soon as he walked in, he knew that's where he was going to spend the rest of his time. He just fell in love with the whole idea of wrestling, and he took to it just so naturally. He had a very mathematical, analytical brain. And in fact, if you hear him clinic, he'll often use terms like fulcrum and, weight distribution and things like that. So he really was kind of this Michelangelo, breaking things down into mathematical parts for wrestling technique. And I think that's what drew him to it. Dave always liked to say that wrestling was more like chess than anything else, strategy moves and counter moves. So his young childhood. And then once he hit that wrestling room, he just took off. He really took off. And, he went to Tbilisi when he was still in high school and took a true silver.
Crazy.
Yeah, at 17, he went to Tbilisi and took a true silver, which there used to be this weird medal system because there were so many, wrestlers from the Soviet Union in it that they would only give one a medal in each weight. So you could actually be 10th, but take a bronze, because they'd only give one Soviet. But he actually took a true silver, which meant he was really second place in a tournament at 17 years old. And that I don't know if it had been done before,
No,
but it was really, really rare.
and I think that's probably the equivalent to the Eureka now, or if the tournament's still around. I'm not sure if it is, but that's one of the.
I think it was tougher. I think it was actually tougher because you had all of those countries, under one roof. Anyway, but it was the toughest tournament in the world, for sure.
Yeah.
And right. And here's something interesting. While he was gone, the state qualifying tournament in California took place, so he missed it. And the high school coaches in California voted that he could not participate in the state tournament because he had missed the qualifier. Because they didn't really want him in the tournament. So Joe DeMeo at Stanford was at Stanford University, and Chris Harpel was at Palo Alto High School, and their coach, Coach Ed Hart, got together and created a petition and ended up getting him back into the state tournament where he won the California state title.
I mean, it's amazing that someone who starts something in 7th grade, just 6 years later, they're wrestling at the toughest tournament in the world that a lot of American senior level athletes didn't even place at ever. And he gets second right away, has that amazing senior year, wins the U.S. Open at Greco, wins the state title, beats Chuck Yagla at the
Midlands.
At the Midlands, which he was like the equivalent of the Hodge Trophy winner, 2-time national champ for Iowa, and Dave beat him as a senior in high school. So that's just really crazy.
Yeah, that was his. Chuck still talks about it today. He's like, everybody brings that match up.
Oh, I can't even imagine.
Yagla's a great guy. Yagla was inducted into the Hall of Fame last year.
And
I see Yagla pretty often around the wrestling mat.
Well, what's interesting to me is that there are a lot of people on record talking about Dave, and one thing that always comes up is they really never knew what was going on between the ears sometimes, because he was so enthusiastic and happy-go-lucky off the mat, but then when he got on, he was extremely serious, and obviously wanted to win with the best of them. So, if you look at the mind of Dave Schultz, what do you think?
A bit of an enigma.
Yeah, definitely. What do you think motivated?
Well, I think a lot of it comes from, I don't know if you know Gene Davis. He now lives in Colorado. He's part of the AAU programs. And Dave, as a young athlete, trained a lot with Gene Davis and AAU. Athletes in Action, AIA.
Okay.
Pardon me. And Gene was just like that. Gene is a strong Christian. He has strong ethics and morals. But you put it on the mat, and he'll rip your arm off.
Yep.
So I think a lot of that, I can be a nice person and I can be friendly, but on the mat, it's, war.
Yeah.
And I think, there was also, Dave had this little kind of impish head game thing that he liked to play with people, because he didn't need to ignite this kind of animosity or anger towards his opponents. Dave didn't care whether he liked you or not, or, he didn't need to hate you to wrestle you. He saw it as a game on the mat, and the best man wins on the mat. Doesn't matter. You don't have to dislike anybody, which a lot of people can't, don't function like that. They need to work up a little bit of kind of aggression, towards their opponent to kind of feel like that. And Dave just didn't need that. So it allowed him this weird, way of going back and forth between really being tough with someone on the mat and then being friendly, or even worse, especially I can think of a funny example with Kenny. Kenny, to getting ready, Kenny liked his space. He liked to, he wanted to keep people at distance. He got, kind of had to get into a certain mental state. And Dave would always, before match, go up and sit right beside him and ask him how his family was.
Kenny Monday.
Yeah, and Kenny go, Dave, leave me alone right now. And then, it'd be 5 minutes before they're going to wrestle.
Well,
I feel like a good strategy and stuff on the mat. And I also think mentally he had some of the same stuff going off the mat sometimes in kind of a fun, playful way. Because he just loved the sport so much, everything about it.
Well, and him and Kenny Monday had some battles. What was he like after a loss?
Depressed. I mean, actually, it's interesting. I've talked to a lot of world and Olympic champions, those ones that you peak. And after a tournament, it's whether you win or lose, there's a down, and obviously losing is worse. But there literally is, you put all of your energies and your focus and your emotion and all of the chemicals that allow you to compete at that level. And then the next day, it's just, you're drained. And I think I remember talking to Sammy Henson one time about it. And it was a couple days after he'd won the Worlds, and I was talking to him. I said, are you feeling a little down? He's like, oh my God, nobody talks about that. but everything you have in your system is just gone. You're kind of depleted chemically, emotionally. So, but after a loss, he was very evaluative. He would always evaluate exactly what he did. He'd write in his notebooks for a day, going back and looking at, tapes and stuff, and, looking at the techniques that caused him to get into trouble. So he always evaluated it.
And it's funny you say that about that post-competition lull. Michael Phelps is probably the most famous who's had issues dealing with that. It's not even a loss, to your point. It's win or loss after that.
Right.
A sense of, emptiness because they were so focused on one thing. But to me, it's hard to imagine, just from what I've read, Dave ever being depressed or anything like that. But, he went through that same thing.
I don't know if it's depressed. That might be a bigger term, not depressed, but certainly reflective and, and upset with himself. I think he had all the skills. It's, when you're at that level, you have the skills to do it. What did you do wrong that we weren't able to win that one, But the one thing I'll say is Dave was very, very humble about his wins and losses. And I always thought that, he had more of that martial arts mentality. And he once said, you better be nice to everybody on the way up because you're going to see all the same people on the way back down. So, I think you need to be gracious in winning and gracious in losing. And for me, it's a really important attribute. And when I was running the Dave Schultz Wrestling Club, it was something that we talked about a lot. You don't gloat when you win, and, don't throw a tantrum when you lose, and somewhere in between, learn how to control your emotions after you compete.
Yeah. Now that
it's as much of a discipline, as the other parts of wrestling.
Yep, absolutely. And I love that concept of thinking of wrestling as a martial art. Just recently, I think that trend's picked up a little bit with the rise of jiu-jitsu and MMA, but before that, no one really thought of wrestling as a martial art. So it's interesting you thought about that way back then even. Well, and I think right now, we have a little bit of a trend of teams. I just went to the NCAA, as did a lot of other people, and I think I saw more control, respect, humility in that tournament than I've seen in a long time. And I think it falls back on, the coaching that's going on and the responsibility that's being taught by some of our coaches like Tom Ryan and at Ohio State and at Penn State and some of these programs. I think they're bringing a little of that martial arts kind of mentality back into wrestling, and I think it makes us look good. Yeah, I actually had Tom Ryan on this show, and that's what really jumped out to me, is that him and Kale, like those guys on that team, they're all just stand-up guys, like 4.0 GPAs. They don't have a mean bone in their body, it doesn't seem like, and they're just super nice guys. Well, they got a little bit of a mean bone. They're winning a lot. Yeah, when they get out there. But I just think they're producing really great human beings. Yeah, I think they're producing well-rounded, respectable, human beings, and that's really good for us as a sport. Yep, absolutely. Now, kind of going back to Dave's athletic career, you guys were traveling a lot. I think you told me, or I read somewhere, that he went to Russia like 25 or 30 times. What do you remember about those international trips back in the day? Well, it was Dave's devotion to getting better technically. And, when he was coming up, when he was 16, 17, 18, the Soviets were by far the best, wrestlers on the planet. Mm-hmm. And so he early on devoted himself to spending as much time with them, around them, or over there, in the rooms over there. So he learned the language. He spoke fluent Russian. Anytime we went on a trip, we would stay after and go some other place and train for a while. And he learned the language specifically so he could hear their techniques and what they were talking about. And then, as soon as the tournament's over, he'd just go grab one of them and say, hey, grab Fedzayev. Hey, show me that trap arm gut, or Karcher, show me that gut wrench, or, he just was not shy about, he just wanted to learn more wrestling all the time. So his trips to the Soviet Union, at one point he changed his stance. He literally went through a 6-month period where he changed his stance to a lower kind of flat back Russian stance that they had back then. As rules change, certain things change, but back then that was a little bit different stance. And so he had back pain for about 3 months, while he altered his position and learned how to stand a little bit different. So he was always focused on getting as much information from those Soviet training situations as he could. So he went as often as he could. And it just sounds like he loved his craft and loved getting better and improving every day. Like it just seems so obvious. from reading
He
about
absolutely did. He had this thing that steel sharpens steel, right? You just keep the better the workout partner, the better you're going to get, the more information. And he always had a notebook. In fact, I've got probably 50 of his notebooks, packed away. He just took notes constantly and referred back to them for kind of taking his own advice, if you will, with training.
And do you think it was notebooks on technique, on mindset, or just anything to improve his
everything?
game?
It's everything. And then he'd have notes on, I just was reading one of them the other day. Somebody asked me a question that made me think of one. So I went back and he's writing notes about KJ, about, Kevin Jackson. And he's watching him compete and he's got all the notes. And I'm sure, he shared it with Kevin at the time, but he's got notes on other people that are competing and notes on his competitors, notes on Russian technique, notes on mental attitude, notes on what puts him in the right frame of mind. So he's very analytical about his training process, but he did love it. He had a pure joy for his sport and for all that surrounds it, for the people, for the process of learning about people, learning new languages, trying new foods, trying new liquors, whatever it is. Like it was a big picture. And I think, ultimately Dave was just such a people person and liked to learn from other people.
Yeah, no, that's evident. And, one thing you said that really piqued my interest was he took notes on what put him in the right state of mind. And I think that's such an important piece of high level performance. Like, what can you remember from those journals? What were some of his?
It changed over time, because he competed for so long. He died when he was 36 and he was still competing. So I think what worked when he was 19 didn't work. So at one stage it was, putting music on, certain types of music and putting headset. At some point it was doing a pretty, when he was younger, really kind of a hard workout right before he wrestled instead of just warming up. As he got older, it's more about taking more time off because you don't heal as quickly. You don't rebound as quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the most interesting thing was how he, over time, adapted all these so that wrestling was still fresh and new all the time. Same as his training techniques. He learned Tai Chi for a while and did that. Then he took up running in army boots through the trees when we lived at Foxcatcher. And then he was swimming for a while. And then, so he just kept recreating his training modes so that it didn't get stale and it didn't get boring.
Yeah. No, that is fascinating. And then, so what do you think about those trips to Russia or the USSR, but some of those republics in there? Like, what do you think about Dave made them love him so much? Because I heard a story once that the Russian fans actually booed when a Russian beat Dave in a match. I don't know if that's true or if that's just folklore, but
no, that's really true. In fact, they threw their shoes out on the mat and everything. It was really crazy. I was there that year.
When was that?
Xander was in Russia, but he was little. You know what it was? I think it was Dave's openness in just, first of all, learning to speak the language. Not very many Americans come over and learn to speak the language. And once you learn to speak the language, you can start to communicate. And then he kept coming over and, he would be very respectful of their cultures and their traditions and all that. And he's just, the Russians love good wrestling. So, in fact, and if you'll notice that if you go to a tournament and the Iranians are there, the Iranians will often cheer for a really great match, whether it's their guy or another guy. And there's a lot of that in the Soviet Union. It's just an appreciation for great technique and, good wrestling. And then I think Dave, after we had Xander, Dave brought Xander over to the Goodwill games when he was 3 months old and let him get passed around the whole venue, with the Russians. And Xander went to Tbilisi when he was 10 years old. So I think they felt like he was sharing their family with him then, and I was over there at least a dozen times. So, and then you just develop friendships, we started this call. I'm doing this tour with Anatoly and Sergei Beloglazov that's coming up. And, we were over there. We knew their families. We knew their kids. We knew their political, stances, what they were suffering through in the country. You become, wrestling's really interesting that way. You just become so close with people. We're an interesting sport in that manner.
Definitely. And it's such a close community. And that's what I love about it. And most of the people I know love about it. And I do want to get to the tour you're doing with the Beloglazovs. Yeah. I think that's really important to bring some of that knowledge over here. But real quick. So what was the time when Dave got beat by a Russian and he was being booed, or the Russian who won was being booed by the fans? Do you remember that?
It was in Tbilisi, and it was one of the final match. I think it was in the finals. And it was just a really, really close call. And I think the ref may have actually, given the benefit of the doubt to their guy.
Yeah.
And I don't even remember who he was wrestling, to be honest. But it was just one of those, and it happens like a lot. You know wrestling. When you're in Iran, look at the World Championship. When it was held in Iran, the Iranians win. When it was held in, yeah. in the United States, we won it. I mean, there's definitely some plan for the old home team,
Yeah.
So I think he did what a lot of refs do, is if it was in doubt, give it to the home team guy. And the Russians just didn't. They stood up, and they don't boo, they whistle. And they whistle. That's their boo. The booing in the Soviet Union is when you whistle.
Okay.
So they were whistling and then taking their shoes and throwing it at the official. He had to run out. They just thought it was a bad call, and they were looking for good wrestling. And they liked Dave.
Yeah. Oh, that is such a cool story. And speaking of the closeness of wrestling and how everyone was a family, when you guys first got married, Mark actually lived with you guys, and then also a lot of the wrestlers from I don't know if like from Bulgaria or from Russia would live with you at your apartment in Norman. That had to be a crazy experience for someone who wasn't that familiar.
I've always showed my house with about a dozen wrestlers. Yeah. First of all, we had a studio in Palo Alto when we were at Stanford. And so a Russian or a Japanese wrestler or somebody would come over, and they'd literally sleep on a mattress in our kitchen. And then so that was part of that. And then when we moved, the Normans was when we were still in college. We got married when we were still in college. We got married. Okay. Dave says, do you want to go to the World Championships with me? And I'm like, yeah. He goes, well, then you have to marry me, because you couldn't travel back then unless you were married. So that was Tuesday, and we got married on Thursday.
No.
So, and I got to go to the World Championships.
Oh wow, I didn't know that was the story behind it.
We'd only known each other about 3 months, but we kind of knew that it was. We thought it might be temporary, because it wasn't a well thought out marriage.
3 months?
Then it turned out at 4 years. 4 years later, we recommitted, and we stayed together 15 years when Dave passed away.
Wow, that's amazing. One thing you don't hear a lot about, just because I think there's been some, not conflict, but just conflicting stories lately, is how close Mark and Dave were. I think with the big screen film that came out, I think there was some, the stories didn't really line up to what really happened. Like, can you talk a little bit about how close Mark and Dave were when you first met them? Like, did they hang out all the time, or were they separate? Like, what was that like?
Inseparable. Mark and Dave were like one person. It was hilarious. So when I married Dave, of course, Mark was the best man, and then we all went home and got into our apartment together. So Mark lived with us. They're just really close. Their childhood, they kind of got bumped around a little bit. They got divorced. Their parents got divorced when they were pretty young, and so they really kind of clung to each other for their support and their emotional support as well. And so they were just really, really tight. And then we were at University of Oklahoma together, and then they both came and coached at Stanford together. And then, they just trained together. It wasn't until basically Mark left Foxcatcher, and which is a little bit of a misinformation in the movie, because in the movie it shows us at Foxcatcher at the same time, and we were never at Foxcatcher at the same time. Yeah. Mark was there for about 11 months before the 88 Olympics, and then he left. And then we showed up the next year. We were there for 7 years. Gotcha.
And let's go into that time a little bit, because that's one of the most fascinating and probably the most well documented. But what was a day in the life like for Dave when you guys were at Foxcatcher?
Well, Foxcatcher was such a unique place. You have all of these Olympic athletes, and there wasn't just wrestling there. There's wrestling, there's swimming, there's pentathlon, triathlon, equestrian. So all these Olympic athletes are training and living there. And it was really this amazing energy of people pulling together and all kind of heading in their own direction for success in athletics. So the environment was really great. And especially for us that have kids, these kids just jump from house to house to house like they had, 20 sets of parents and aunts and uncles, so to speak, So the family environment was amazing, and the training was just ridiculous. Because DuPont was able to put so much money into Foxcatcher, we constantly had, maybe 10 to 15 athletes from other countries training in the room. And you just have that kind of influence, just raises the level of wrestling. You have the Bulgarians one week, and then some Soviets the next week, and then you have, the Czech guys, and, on and on and on, just Japanese team coming in, and you just have this power building, going on all the time.
Wow. And then let's take for just a normal weekday, right? Most.
Yeah, I mean, it was a get up, train in the morning. Dave would wake up and go for an early morning training, run, some sort of aerobic training in the morning. Then he'd come back, and then he used to work in the office because as much as Dave was also competing, he was definitely part of the coaching staff at Foxcatcher. He did a lot of the coordinating, who was coming in, when they were coming in, when they were airport runs. He was the one that was the liaison to the foreign athletes coming in and stuff. So he would always work in the morning. He used to go have lunch with the kids at school, which the principal used to have to call me and tell me to take my big kid home. He's causing trouble over at the cafeteria.
No way.
Yeah, he would come in and go like, ice cream for everybody, and just cause total chaos. So a couple of times the principal, Tom Cook, would call and say, can you come and get Dave? I can't get the kids to come in from recess.
Oh, that's funny. Wow.
So anyway, yeah, and then come back, and then he used to kind of maybe do some weightlifting in the afternoon sometime at some point. And then, of course, you have, the 3:30, 4 practice. Dave was notoriously known for being extremely late, which left people frustrated with him. And then, by 7 or 8, he was home and got to put, dinner together and have to take the kids to school. But then there's a lot of travel. Foxcatcher team competed a lot, so he competed a lot. And when he wasn't competing, he was coaching the team. And he coached a lot of U.S. teams for a while. He took several U.S. teams over to the Soviet Union and different countries. So he was busy coaching as well as competing.
Man, those stories are just awesome. So I want to shift into a couple rapid fire questions. So these are more quick hitting. So true or false that Dave once climbed the Golden Gate Bridge?
True.
All right, now I gotta go a little bit deeper because I used to live.
You said quick.
I know, but I used to live in San Francisco and I ran across the Golden Gate Bridge several times. What do you know about that story?
Well, from the bottom where the road goes across, but it's still hard.
Yeah.
They use the same, it's where the painters and the repair people use. There's rungs, but it's really, I mean, first of all, you can be arrested.
Yeah.
Second, it's, so it was crazy. He did it with a couple friends, and I'm not gonna say names.
Yeah. Don't out them here.
they were wrestlers. They're other wrestlers. They'll know who they are when they listen to the podcast.
Oh my God.
There was a few of them, so they made it, and they made it safely back down. So that's a true statement.
That's just awesome.
He had a little bit. He was a bit of an adrenaline junkie. He liked to go, bungee jumping, rock climbing, skydiving. He went skydiving with I'm not gonna be able to say it. No, Don Briggs.
Okay.
Used to be at Northern Iowa. So he liked to push the limits a little bit on the whole adrenaline thing.
Gosh, it sounds like it. What I think, just a follow up to that, is obviously the guy. He wasn't like a typical Iowa style guy where he only wrestled and that's all he cared about. He had a lot of interests. What were some of his, hobbies or passions that people might not know about?
Yeah, he learned to shoot. He was at the Olympic Training Center one year, and he went to shoot with the shooting team. And he learned how to shoot really well. So he had a collection of probably 20 kinds of guns, and he learned how to be an excellent shooter. And he trained with some of the Navy SEALs that were out, part of DuPont's team of protection sometimes when they come out.
Wow.
He was a big bike rider. He liked to ride bikes. He rock climbed. He made his own bullets for a lot of his guns. He learned how to do that. He did Tai Chi. So about every 3 or 4 years, he'd change up and pick a new hobby and become excellent at it.
Wow, that's cool. And then what about last rapid fire here is, what are some of the books you would read? Not about wrestling, but I always ask people what personal development books they read, and Tom Ryan has a list of them. But do you remember any books in particular that he read or that were really influential to him?
Yeah, one of the most important books he read was Samurai. Hold on, let me think of the name of it for a second. It was about. Give me a second. Musashi. That was one of the
Book
books.
of Five Rings. Yeah.
Yeah. No. The book's just called Musashi. It's kind of it's a big, thick book, and it's about the life of Musashi and his training techniques. But because of that book, then he also read a lot of those spin-off books. But a lot of those spin-off books have taken those lessons and spin it into business, things like that. But you can use that information everywhere you want. But Musashi was one of his really favorites, and he used to use a lot of quotes from that. And I can even send you a list of some of his favorites if you want me to.
Yeah, that'd be great. We'll put them in the show notes. I always think that's such an interesting part of it because, obviously the beauty about books is that we can all read that and read the same things that some of these super successful people did.
I love that question. That's cool, right?
Well, I was just dying to know because he seems like a guy that you would want to emulate. And so I'm like, all right, what the heck was he reading all the time? Because he had such a unique outlook on life. Well, and then now, so after Dave's passing, you started the Dave Schultz Wrestling Club, and obviously you're still one of the most important people in the wrestling community. You're being inducted into the Hall of Fame this year. But this summer, you're hosting a clinic where you're bringing the Beloglazov brothers over from Russia and doing a kind of like a road show for 2 months. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I can't stop doing this stuff. Once you're in wrestling, you just can't get out. So my daughter once, I think when she was about 8, after Dave had died, she had her hands on her hips and she looked me squarely in the eye. She goes, "First, Dad made us go to all this wrestling stuff. Now you make us go to the wrestling stuff." And she just made a comment about it the other day because when she asked she's going to go to my Hall of Fame induction. So she said, "Again, really?"
Yeah.
She's funny. For me, I think one of the greatest things about wrestling is that we put human beings together without boundaries, without politics, and we just become friends. And that, sits above and, on top of what we do as a sport, which is, wrestling itself. But I think it really is something that makes us unique. And I'm very proud to have been part of that, kind of world friendship organization that we all have. And I'm very fortunate to have had friends all over the world who was good when Dave was alive and also provided support and kindness and, friendship to my children. So I really like to keep those doors open. And Anatoly Beloglazov and Sergei Beloglazov have been friends since I was 20 years old when I first met them at some tournament. And when you're at that level, you're at the same tournaments. You're at the World Cup. You're at the World Championships. You're at you see them 5, 6, 7 times a year, and you just get to be friends because you're all in the same hotel together. You're having dinner together. You're having lunch together. You're just interacting so much. So Anatoly's son, Alexei, who it's kind of fun because my son is an Alexander too. So we have, Alexander. So I'm talking to Alexander Beloglazov, and he said, "Hey, the brothers wondered if my dad and my uncle wondered if you might be able to set up a camp they could do in the U.S." And I've helped run camps before. I don't want to do that. So I was like, "No." And I goes, "But I think, I could probably bring you over here and schedule you, and in my mind, I'm thinking, maybe 5 or 6 clinics, maybe they do a day at some people's camps, kind of like Jay Robinson camp or, whatever the camps are scheduled, they can do stuff like that." And so it went from my idea about 5 or 6. We now have 22 stops in the U.S. starting on May 19th and continuing to July 8th, and at which point then they'll go to Canada and do a couple of more clinics up in Canada. So I've been talking to coaches and scheduling travel for the last 3 months. They start out, they're in Sunnyvale, California, they're in Portland, Oregon, they're in Franklin Park, Illinois, so near Chicago. They're doing 3 in New York. I mean, they're all over the country. So I'm really excited. I'll see them a couple times. I'm not going to be with them on the tour the whole time, but I'll meet them in Oklahoma because they happen to come in during my Hall of Fame induction. And then I'll see them again down in California, and then they're going to stay at my house in Portland for about 5 days over the 4th of July holiday and stuff.
Wow, that's cool. 5
It's really exciting.
Wow. And for the folks who don't know who those guys are, multiple-time world, multiple-time Olympic champions from the Soviet Union. It's funny. I noticed that the Schultz brothers and the Beloglazovs were 2 of 3, I think, who won world and Olympic titles.
Right.
I mean, just incredible. So, I mean, those guys, you're learning from the best. And so where can the listeners find information about that clinic if they want to? So
I've been working with Dan McCune, who's the head coach of Fremont High School in Sunnyvale, California. And he has a website called wrestling.life, and www.wrestling.life/Beloglazov is where you can get all the information. Every one of the clinics is listed there. You can click on a link. You can go to it and register directly for the clinic you want to go to right there.
Okay. And Beloglazov is Beloglazov for the listeners.
You got it. Yeah.
Really cool. It's
very exciting to work with them on this because it's just grown. It's so successful. I noticed Alexi left me a note. He goes, "I've got some thoughts on next year," and I was like, "Next year?"
Oh my God. Well, I mean, for people listening, I saw the travel schedule, and it's fly out of Chicago, land in New York. You drive around 3 days there, then you fly to Oklahoma. So that's crazy and so cool you're doing that.
I know. I told him, I said, "I'm really worried about you," and he said, "We live in the Soviet Union and do these all the time, so we're not worried about it. We live in Russia, so they're used to traveling." So I really was worried about them. I kept trying to book, a couple days, breaks between them. They're like, "Nope, book us up."
Those guys that's a different kind of tough over there. They're not worried about that kind of stuff. I think just the last thing we'll say is, again, you're getting inducted into the Hall of Fame this year. What Hall of Fame is that, and what does that mean to you? And then we'll sign off here.
I am so humbled by that whole experience. I just started thinking about, they wanted a draft of my speech, and I really, it's more about what people have done for me than anything I've done for wrestling. Because when Dave got killed, it's just, it's obviously a horrible, horrible, traumatizing time in your life. And it was the wrestling people who stepped up and just literally carried me through that time, sitting in the courtroom with me, were Dan Shade and Greg Olinsky and the guys from Foxcatcher, and going through the process and just, helping me raise my kids. And I don't know, it's just been a tremendous ride, through the friendship of the sport of wrestling has given to me. So for me, this is the greatest honor. I'm being inducted in the National Wrestling Hall of Fame under the Order of Merit, which is someone that did not compete in the sport, but gave back to it. Yep. And that'll be held in Stillwater, Oklahoma at the Hall of Fame weekend, honors weekend in June 1st through the 3rd, Stillwater, Oklahoma this June.
Powerful. Very exciting.
Very powerful. I'm so honored.
It's just an incredible thing, but I think it's a couple years late just based on what you've done for the sport. I mean, we didn't really get into the Dave Schultz Wrestling Club or the Dave Schultz tournament, but I think it's just, I knew about, the things you were doing even when I was in middle school and didn't even know who Dave was. So I think it's well deserved and something that I'm excited to see the speech and see it all go down. So
thank you so much, Ron. Those are kind words. I appreciate it.
Any last words for the audience before we sign off here about wrestling, about Dave, about just anything you want to share before we sign off?
Just thank you to all this big family of wrestling for all of the love and support I've been given over the years, and check out the clinics.
That's it. Check it out, people. Well, Nancy, thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking some time.
Thanks, Ryan. Have a nice day.
And all great things must come to an end. That's the end of this episode, but it's not the end of the season or the show. Thank you for listening, everybody. If you want to support the podcast, please go to iTunes, give us a rating and subscribe, and also check out wrestlingmind.com for blogs and archived shows. Have a great day.